going to talk today through the lens of focusing specifically on the sort of food service world. And I recognize today that in the room, the full value chain is represented here. And so we'll come back around to how some of the things that are relevant in food service apply more generally, and the connections between these elements are quite relevant. But my focus will be specifically walking us through this from the point of view of folks who are operating food service facilities and are dealing with food loss and waste in that particular context. And just to sort of dial in which part of Eva's data set that we're talking about here, I've just repeated her slide that sort of kind of points out that chunk that we focus on. So you've heard a little bit just about my background, and I'm not really here today to talk about LeanPath and what we do commercially, but really more to talk about some of the things that we've learned and the principles that drive us in the work that we do. And we do this for the love of food. When we look at this topic, we can all be very rational, and we can talk about the financial and the social and environmental elements of this problem. But if we get down to it at a deeper level, food is something that connects us. It is emotional. It is the core of how culture coheres, how families cohere, how we meet and build relationships and extend those relationships. And when you think about that connection and then the amount of loss that's associated with it, it's a pretty disappointing and tragic situation where we are throwing a lot away. Now, what you're looking at here are some pictures that we've taken. These are actual waste events in food service operations recently. And when you look at these, hopefully what you notice is these are not odds and ends. These are full vessels of French toast or fruit or other things that we might not be able to fully differentiate, at least with the resolution here. But the point is, we are throwing away a tremendous amount of perfectly good food, and we have the opportunity to do something about it. So the first step in that process is recognizing the problem. And that might be a little more difficult than some people imagine, because this thing is truly the elephant standing in the middle of our kitchens. We have become so familiar with this problem that we, in many cases, don't see it anymore. It blends in, and we interpret it in all kinds of interesting ways where, oh yeah, well, we had to make that because we would have, we would have disappointed someone, or we would have run out, or we didn't want to be inhospitable, or any number of really deep ruts, social norms, expectations that are out there that cause us to waste food. They've almost gotten to the point where we just don't see them. And so step one here is just saying, look, food waste is a very significant problem, and we've got to redirect people's attention to it, get people to recognize that it's there, and we all need to engage in the process of ushering that elephant out of the kitchen, and in doing, we will be taking control. And the good news in this is today's conference is focused on is that there are solutions. This is difficult, but not impossible to solve. And with a bit of energy and effort, we have the opportunity in front of us right now to see dramatic change in this arena. So zooming right into the nuts and bolts of the food service world, we have two kinds of food waste streams that we typically manage: pre-consumer and post-consumer. And the pre-consumer we would define as those items that are thrown away by a food service operator. They are typically overproduction, spoilage, expiration, trimmings from fresh meat and produce, things that have been burned, dropped, contaminated, and they are very actionable. And indeed, the vast majority of that particular fraction tends to be overproduction, which is the lever that we can push on most directly to drive change. The other side is the post-consumer, which is the plate waste, which is what's left on our plates at the end of a meal period. And I point this out because there are very different causes for each of these fractions. And yet, by the time we get to looking into the organics bin and seeing them all commingled, we think of it as food waste. It's just one thing, but it's not. It's really a set of things that are occurring for different reasons. And so if we want to focus on prevention, we have to be willing to go back and look at these as separate fractions. Specifically, the pre-consumer waste fraction is about 4 to 10% of what we see purchased by many food service operators. So if you're spending $1 million on food, we're often seeing $40,000 to $100,000 showing up as pre-consumer food waste. So just to make that point, that never got to a customer. That's $40,000 to $100,000 that just got thrown away behind the scenes or in the course of preparing that product or merchandising that product. And so we've got many, many dollars of opportunity associated with that. But it's not just the value of food that is being thrown away. This is one of those multiplicative problems where you have a series of areas where it's costing you money. So you've got the cost of the food, of course, that is being thrown away, but then you also have all of the other inputs, whether that is energy and water associated with refrigerating that product and preparing it. It's the labor involved in taking it and prepping it and cooking it and putting it out and then washing the pans, paying the invoices, all the paperwork around it. There's the lost sales and profit, and then you get the great honor of paying to have it disposed in some way. So you look at this and you've really got sort of 5 ways that you pay for a waste event that's delivering zero value. So these are sort of wake-up calls, I think, as we try to make people aware of that elephant in the room. We've got to find ways of telling this story so that whether it's a food service operator or more broadly, anyone who's working on the food waste issue, they can see it more clearly because it is right in front of us and very expensive and yet overlooked. So some of the reasons that we see food waste occur, particularly in the food service world, are on the screen here. And I want to just talk to a few of them because root cause analysis is a pretty important part of the process of fixing this. So the first one that I mentioned that's a huge one is overproduction. And we know that that is rampant in almost every food service environment with the exception of very small cook-to-order restaurants where you truly have the luxury of preparing everything exactly at the moment of service. But generally, if you have to do much prep, you're going to be facing this overproduction problem. And it has a lot to do with the fear of running out and the fear of disappointing customers. And I want to focus for a minute on that word fear, because if you look at this waste equation, in many cases, it is correlated to risk management, fear management. We often waste food as a mechanism to, in our own minds, reduce risk. So we make too much because we don't want to run out. Or the next box, which is food safety. We often hear the phrase, when in doubt, throw it out, right? And I would argue that might have been good at some point in time, but it's probably, we're going to need to be a little more sophisticated in our analysis than that at this point in time with this problem. And so we now look at these food safety programs, and of course, no one will ever debate that food safety comes before waste management. That's, human health is of course going to be the priority. But when you actually look at how we implement these things, in many cases we have margins of error designed around margins of error, to the point where everyone knows they're throwing away perfectly good product that's perfectly edible, and we're just going through the motions. And that is, again, risk management, fear management. And so we've got to look at this with fresh eyes, and we have to say, okay, are our policies really aligned with what we know today about the full costs of this equation? Because risk transfer actually isn't free. When we think of it, historically, we've thought of food waste as kind of cheap, right? We just throw it in the garbage and the problem goes away. We don't worry about it. Our other problem is solved. But the truth is that it's not free, as I've pointed out, the financial components, and we've also talked about the other dimensions of this. In other ways, we waste food pretty consistently. We over-merchandise. We're all afraid that people will think that the product that we place in front of folks, whether it's in a grocery environment or it's in a buffet, is not going to look bountiful and beautiful enough, and thus we over-merchandise, and we end up with a lot of product that's there that doesn't get sold. Sometimes we're focused on labor trade-offs, and we think, well, if we make a lot of product quickly, we can have fewer labor hours, and then we'll be better off. But we inevitably find that when you batch in big batches, you typically end up with waste because you can't use it in the way you thought you would. We want massive customer experience and choice, and that's an expectation, and so that, of course, costs us in terms of waste as well. When we're doing catering at events like this, whoever's responsible for the food today undoubtedly faced a challenge because of the topic that we're doing and their natural inclinations to make sure they didn't run out. Often there is padding built in, and people are making sure that they don't disappoint. There are a variety of other reasons why this occurs. I don't have time to go into great detail on all of them, but the core of this stuff is it has a lot to do with risk, it has a lot to do with fear, it has a lot to do with behavior, and it has a lot to do with us not seeing the problem clearly. So how do we solve this? Of course, there are many options, and Eva's given us a terrific analytical framework to look at that, and so I'm not going to focus on it, and I'm also not going to spend time on the hierarchy since Kai has walked us through it. But I will say I am a very transparent partisan on this topic. I am here to talk about prevention, which is at the top, source reduction, synonymous with prevention, because this thing gets a lot of sort of, people nod to it and say, yes, prevention, that makes sense, and then they walk right by it and they do everything else in the hierarchy. And we have to stop that, because there actually are things that we can do related to prevention that are very, very actionable, and the financial benefits are massive when you look at preventing a loss compared to the disposal costs that might be averted from that same loss not ending up in the garbage. So if you look at sort of your food cost savings from prevention versus your waste disposal costs associated with something, you see stark differences, such as in the case with meat. When you look at the environmental impacts in terms of GHGs that are generated, the vast majority of the footprint is coming upstream from the agricultural system, as we heard earlier, very little from the actual downstream. And so I'm not here to say the rest of the hierarchy doesn't matter. It does, and I'm hugely supportive of us working the whole thing, and I know there are many terrific solutions in the room today. I just want to make sure that people don't overlook the prevention piece. And we do run into a couple of things that we just like to call people's attention to, just like the elephant in the room. The first is the romance of composting. What is more romantic, right? Then we're going to trim these things, and then we're going to put the trimmings in the compost bin, and then it's going to go back to the farm, and we're going to grow fresh fruits and vegetables, and then we're going to bring them back and serve them, and it's a virtuous loop. And except it's not lossless, and there's a tremendous amount of loss in that loop. And we need to be sure that we don't just compost our way out of this. And there was some recent research at Ohio State in the US that was pretty fascinating on this, where they took 3 cohorts of people through a free lunch. One group, they said nothing, and they just gave them free lunch, and they watched what they threw away. The second group, they told food waste was really bad. And the third group, they told food waste was really bad, but good news, everything at lunch would be composted. And what happened was very clear. The people who heard food waste was bad didn't waste much at all. The people that heard food waste was bad and it would be composted wasted quite a lot. So there is a concern here around mixed messages and making sure that people understand that there isn't just an excuse if we compost something. In the same way, recycling isn't simply an excuse. I think there's also some things to just reflect on around donating and recovering food. Clearly, I want excess edible food to go to people, absolutely. But there's also some weird little dynamics, particularly in a food environment, where if food service employees know that their food that's excess will be donated, they might produce to that because it feels good to support others. And basically, we're creating, in some cases, philanthropists with our own food budgets. And it's pretty easy to give away other people's money. So we have to be aware of these little sort of tensions and counter elements that are in this model. It's not quite as simple as just saying, hey, we'll just move down the hierarchy. We have to understand there are going to be communication elements that need to be very, very crisp and clear. So how do we deliver on the promise of prevention at the top of the hierarchy? I believe that food waste is largely a behavioral problem, particularly in the food service world, based on all the things I've just shared with you. And that if we want to prevent it, we have to get everyone in a food operation to consistently repeat the right behaviors at scale. And that means being aware of the elephant and in the kitchen and doing something about it. And so the step in driving that behavior change is recognizing that food waste is a critical control point. And for those who are in the food world, the word critical control point should ring a bell. We do pretty much everything we do around food safety has to do with hazard analysis and critical control points, measuring temperatures at key points in the process of handling that food to keep it safe. Well, I'm going to suggest to you that the garbage is a critical control point, and that what is in the food waste bin is not simply a food residual, which hopefully we can do something good with. It's actually a whole barrel of ideas, opportunities for improvement, the very manifestation of our inefficiency writ large in front of us. So we need to look at that, and we need to work with that. And so that leads us to the thought clearly that measurement of what we throw away is important. If we can't measure it, we can't improve it. So food waste measurement is about learning. It's about analysis so that we can get our hands around the problem. But it's also about something else. And it's really important to recognize that when we measure, we don't simply collect data. We actually also engage our frontline teams in this issue. And so the very act of measurement is itself an intervention. And we've seen this, that from a behavioral science point of view, that when people are involved in measuring wasted food, their awareness level goes up. And even if people aren't doing a whole heck of a lot with the data, we will typically see impact in terms of waste prevention because there has been an awareness lift associated with this problem. And they are having to go through a process of actually thinking about it briefly before discarding it. So often we focus on the data, and indeed the data is an important output from measurement, but it is not the only important output. So please recognize that this is a key part of it. So we're on a real crusade to put food waste on the scoreboard in every kitchen and to get people measuring it on a daily basis the same way they think about quality and safety and customer satisfaction and sanitation. This thing needs to be right up there with everything else. And so the big objection to this historically has been, well, how? How could we possibly do that? And the good news is we're now in an era where there are food waste smart meters that make this feasible. And this is a category that our business at LeanPath has created, and we're happy to see that we're not the only ones doing it. There's others who are joining us in it, and so there's good innovation happening from a variety of fronts in this area. So if people are bought into the idea that prevention matters and measurement is the mechanism to get there, there are ways to do this today that are not difficult, that involve typically scales and touchscreen input devices and photography, and but also feedback loops that deliver information at the exact point of discard right back to frontline team members so that we do raise awareness. And so when I talked about those two interventions, one being data collection and the other being awareness building and employee engagement, we have to do both. It's not just about getting the information. It's also about making people at that moment aware of the critical choices that they're making and their consequences. And this, by the way, doesn't just limit itself to food service workers. It can also apply to us. Whoops, to us. Get your attention there. You, us, as consumers. And we're now doing this where we're feeding back these data loops to people at the point they scrape things into dish returns, and are showing them the weight of the thing they just scraped into the bin. And you know, it's just like those little speed feedback things when you're driving and it tells you you're exceeding the speed limit, and you go, oh, I better slow down. So we want to motivate action, and we have to get people thinking about this. We also have to put data in their hands at the moment that it's actionable. So building workflows that use this data to sort of push it to frontline team members is something that we think is going to be very important, so that as people have problems occur, they have the ability to act on them. And when we do all of these things, what we find is that people adjust production levels. They change how much they're overproducing. They get more confident that they don't have to buy as much insurance in order to get through that meal period. They may not overproduce to zero, but they're going to overproduce a lot less. They're going to choose batch production that is more responsibly sized, smaller batches, hopefully much smaller. And they are going to, in the hotel environment particularly, get more confident working with their clients on what the appropriate sort of guarantees and pad factors should be. They'll purchase differently, adjusting standing par levels, considering alternate options, and adjusting pack sizes. And this is where the whole value chain comes to play. We see a tremendous amount of waste come just because big packages show up in kitchens where people don't take the time to break down 5 pounds of ground beef. If a recipe only calls for 4, they don't break it down and save that extra pound and wrap it up and put it back in a walk-in. It just all goes in the recipe, and then we've overproduced. So working with the supply chain to be able to get everything sized to the right pack sizes for optimum consumption is an area for collective innovation. We'll see people adjusting order guides and menus based on what they're learning around waste so that they can eliminate high waste items and structure their menus, particularly for group events, with knowledge about how many of us today are going to eat a croissant or a bagel or a whole piece of fruit, because those ratios are going to vary by group demographics, by time of year. We need to know those things. And ultimately, this is about, in the end, influencing frontline behavior. So basically making sure that people are thinking and doing things in a different way, and then fulfilling, or filling, I should say, any skills gaps that they have, whether they may need help learning how to trim a watermelon more efficiently, or other things that they may be leading to waste. And we find when people do all of this, they typically save 2 to 6% on their food purchases. You heard the report from WRI on a 14-to-1 return ratio, cutting pre-consumer food waste in half. And so there's a clear business case here. And I don't have a lot of time, so I won't focus on the case studies today, other than to say, if you take a look at my presentation later, you'll see a couple of these about some things that have been going on in large-scale food environments like Google, where they have substantially reduced waste, with Aramark, where they are doing broad-based programs around waste measurement throughout large chunks of their operations and seeing substantial reductions. You know, I hope ultimately to inspire the food business to recognize its essential role in fixing this problem. And particularly in food service, I find that one way to make this point is I share with frontline food service workers the picture of this train. And this is a train, it's a garbage train. It's running down the beautiful Columbia River Gorge near where I live in Oregon. It's bringing all the trash from Seattle to Oregon, and runs a couple times a week. And it's an import business for us, apparently. We point out to food service workers, who do you think has the ability to pull a full rail car off of that train? It's probably not us at home with the work that we do in our own menu planning, but at work, we own this problem. We are the ones who will pull the full cars off the train and will really make an impact. And so it's a huge problem, but it's also an exciting opportunity. And it just requires little tweaks in behavior, recognizing our fear, getting ourselves to see clearly the elephant in the room, and we'll get ahead of it. And up and down the value chain, I think a lot of these lessons are just as applicable. Measurement certainly has been well adopted in the manufacturing world with Lean and Six Sigma, and it's pretty well understood. We just need to make sure that those tools are being applied against this problem of food loss and waste. We need to look at those pack size questions. We need to contemplate questions of, are we processing food at the right layer of the supply chain? One common question I get from operators is, should I bring in pre-cut produce or should I cut it on site? And there's a whole bunch of dynamics that go into that, but we're seeing some fascinating things happen in the New York area with a produce supplier that's doing a fabulous job of creating entirely new markets for trimmings that any given food service operation would never be able to access because they don't have critical mass. But one level up in the supply chain, they are able to create those markets. And so we all have this opportunity to engage in a discussion around where do we fit and how can we help the people below us or above us in the chain to improve. So I hope that you'll leave today. I know you already showed up being interested in this topic, but I hope you'll leave feeling that this is something that we can fix, and it's something that we just need to lean into pretty hard, and I think we'll see a lot of progress. So I thank you for your time.